Good evening. It's great to have you all. I apparently can't operate a microphone, so it is exciting to have everyone here. We see people joining. Please do like, share, subscribe, do all those things that I'm not the best at reminding everyone to do. I do have some exciting, up-to-date news that I want to share with you all before we have our special guest on. Many of you have been asking, when is the next episode of our covenant theology coming out? And I am here to let you know that it will be happening this week, Wednesday. So make sure that you check out the channel, like, subscribe, so that you can actually get notified of when that happens. Those are premiere drops. And so they will drop probably Wednesday if everything goes well, Lord willing. But I also want to update you all on a good buddy of mine asked me to join along with Dr. Alan Davis this Thursday. If you haven't subscribed to Rethinking Adventism, you need to do that because this will be Thursday when we will be going live in a 4-part series on working through the investigative judgment. I know some of you might be wondering, why would you spend all that time? Well, it tends to be a complicated doctrine, so we kind of want to do it justice. And hopefully you all will be able to determine whether or not you think it's biblical or not. And before we invite our guest on the show, I ask again, please do subscribe. I am honored that you would participate with us tonight. Share this with your friends, with your family. And then the last thing I would say is one extra kind of added part. I know that I always show this QR code. If you scan that QR code, you'll get the blog. You'll get access to the YouTube channel, some kind of bits of, stuff about who I am and what I do. But the new addition is you'll find a link to our Discord server. So if you want to engage with a community at the Thinking Cup, talk about biblical items, talk through themes, topics, share content, just kind of get involved, equip each other with studying the Word of God in a way that honors Him, please do that through that link. So without any further ado, I am going to invite our special guest, Steve Daly. Dr. Daly, how are you doing, sir?
Doing great.
I love it. I was saying before while we were chatting, I love seeing all those books behind you. My wife and I just put a big library in upstairs in her office, and we're working on filling it with all those books. So the audience, just so the audience knows, I asked Dr. Daly, did you read all those books?
And I've read at least parts of all of them, read some of them many times over. So just depends on the book.
I love it. I love it. Well, Steve, give the audience just a little bit of some might already be familiar with your work. Others may not. I guess my first kind of question would be, did you used to be an Adventist, Dr. Daly?
Yes, I was. It's interesting because I was an Adventist minister for 35 years, but really most of my ministry was committed to trying to change the church and trying to get the church out of its, what I would consider cultic mentality and self-centered remnant kind of thinking. I rejected that from the beginning. So, you can say yes and no. I was an Adventist, but I felt God had called me to try to change the church in a more healthy direction. And I did the best I could for about 35 years till they couldn't put up with me anymore. But that was pretty much the story.
35 years. So were you a minister for 35 years? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. I was
okay.
Ordained Adventist minister for 35 years.
And then after all those years, you let the serpent in, didn't you?
Yeah. Then I fell into those bright lights that will go dead, according to Ellen White.
Man, you and me both. It's weird. I don't feel like the lights dim though. I don't know about you.
Yeah, they got a lot brighter, thankfully. Although I'd have to say, even during that 35 years, I was really not an Adventist in the sense of believing Adventist stuff, and I knew the gospel very early on, even when I was in seminary and stuff. So no thanks to Adventism, but thanks to a lot of, well, Brinsmead was still an Adventist, and he
Mm,
played a big role in me
yeah.
getting the gospel right early on, and Ford and others. But it was clearly, an uphill battle trying to break through the bondage of Adventism. And, I felt like a lot of progress was made. I think my Adventism for a New Generation book really made a big
Mm.
impact on the church. And many have told me that it made a huge impact in their lives. So it wasn't wasted years, certainly. And I had many blessings and many positive things. People like to try to portray me as angry and bitter, and that's anything but the case. I enjoyed my years in Adventism, and was blessed by many positive things during those years, but have been more blessed and more joy filled in the last 15 years since I've been out of it.
Yeah, while my experience is obviously not the same as yours, we all have different journeys. My experience out of Adventism has been very similar, where some of my most joyous moments have been now that I am no longer a part of that bondage. Um, so I want to ask. So I know that you've got probably two of the more popular books, and I put them on the edge there for those of you that are watching. I was first introduced to your psychobiography book. And I have to tell you a little bit, and we didn't plan any of this behind the scenes, actually. When I picked up this particular book, I didn't know who you were. I didn't know, the first book that I picked up was years ago prior to leaving, and it was Dale Ratzliff's book on the Sabbath.
Right.
And I remember very distinctly my closest friend at the time, who was a pastor, an Adventist pastor, told me, like, be careful. Like, it was almost like that's an evil book. Be careful. That's a bad book. And so when I picked up your book for the first time, I remember I was still an Adventist at the time. Okay. And I remember reading some of this stuff, and I'm like, I'll be honest with you, Dr. Daly. I kind of felt like you were angry. Like, my knee jerk reaction as an Adventist reading this book was like, man, what is wrong with this guy? He's so angry, and like, he's so abrupt, and so like, what's wrong? So I want to talk a little bit, just to set the record straight. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what motivated you to write the book, the first book that came out. What inspired you to come up with a book called The Psychobiography of Ellen White? Like, what prompted you for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, I was a licensed psychologist since 1991, and um, the whole field of psychobiography is a field of literature that I was familiar with and interested in. Erickson's Psychobiography of Luther made a big impact on my life, and um, I'd read a powerful psychobiography on Gandhi that had really inspired me, and I felt that Ellen was a classic candidate for a psychobiography. But,
Mm.
when I left Adventism in 2010, I really had no intention on writing any more about it. I'd written 9 books on Adventism, and I'd written the book I'm writing right now is my 29th book. So I've written a lot of books, and most of them have to do with the gospel and Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God, and some to do with psychology as well. But my books on Adventism were generally books trying to call the church to a different place than where it was. And, I was always in trouble for that reason. I was fortunate to be in Southern California, so I was protected by some powerful people down here. I would have been kicked out of the church when I wrote Adventism for a New Generation, because there were a lot of enemies and a lot of people who just thought I was the Antichrist. But, basically, I was kind of tired and sick of Adventism when I left in 2010. The dishonesty of the leadership over all those 35 years of ministry had really worn on me. And I was just kind of relieved and glad to get out from under the oppression and the bondage and the whole thing. And I was just absolutely loving life, pastoring the non-denominational church that I was in. And I thought I'd turn this phone off.
It must be an important call.
No, our home phone gets nothing but worthless calls. And I'm sure this is another one. I hope my wife will grab it anyway.
But maybe it's a telemarketer calling, right?
I'm sure it's a telemarketer. I took the thing off the hook down here, so I didn't think it could ring, but whatever. Anyway, I felt that it was just great to be away from the oppression, the bondage, Big Brother always looking over my shoulder, always having to, deal with all the grief of my preaching and my writing that comes when you're in Adventism and you speak the truth. You're just always going to be under attack from really the left and the right. I ended up experiencing my share of attack from the left as well. But again, I really wanted nothing more to do with Adventism, and our church, that were all people who had left Adventism, really weren't wanting to talk and think about Adventism much either. They'd had enough of it, basically. So we were all healing from Adventist subculture. And then, we basically had the hacking of the White Estate that occurred in 2012. And I started reading about that in 2013, 2014. Things started coming up on the internet that had been withheld from me as a researcher, which I was quite unhappy about. This was material I should have been given access to as a researcher, and it was withheld from me. So that stimulated my interest again to say, holy Toledo, what's going on here? And then I saw the way the White Estate lied about it and covered it up and claimed that they were releasing everything before the 100th anniversary of Ellen White's death in honor of their openness, which was
how ironic, right?
Yeah, a blatant lie. It was because the people who had hacked this White Estate were putting this stuff out on the internet. That was the reason that they were doing it, which, is so typical, just always lying, always deceitful. So I decide, maybe I do have another book left in me on Adventism. I want to research this stuff that I wasn't given access to from her diaries and things. And but really the research question that I pursued was, will the tremendous number of accusations against Ellen White of pathology and fraud stand up to historical and psychological scrutiny? The whole history of Adventism is filled with people who attacked Ellen, who accused her of fraud, who accused her of plagiarism, who accused her of financial disorders based on visions, and just all kinds of accusations both during her lifetime and after. So I wanted to just study this stuff and delve into it as I never had before. Look at all the accusers, try to evaluate whether there was valid historical evidence for their accusations, and then try to unpack it psychologically in terms of, if indeed these things were true, what kind of a person was Ellen White that would generate these lifetime and even after her life criticisms? Would have been much greater had they not buried the 1919 Bible conference transcripts. That was a real attempt on the part of church leaders to come clean and deal with the problem. And then the right wingers won out and threw Daniels and all these people out of office. and they took over the church, and you really had the dark ages of Adventism between 1919 and 1949, with Nickel and Andreasen, and just the complete right wing Ellen White worshiping Adventism of that period is really the most disgusting. And then in the 50s, the Figure administration tried to implement evangelical Adventism, and they had a little success and then got shot down themselves. But it's a fascinating study. And, as I researched this, I'd taught Adventist history for years at the university level, but I had never dug into the critics and the accusers of Ellen White the way I did in writing this psychobiography. And, to me, it was just quite fascinating to see how true the accusations were and how they fit perfectly with the historical documentation. And then unpacking that psychologically was something that was quite challenging and enjoyable, really, to look at the psychological dynamics of this woman. She's quite amazing in what she accomplished. She really is the most successful plagiarist in all of human history. There's no one that even comes close to her. And, obviously Joseph Smith got a lot of bad publicity, but it was much better known that he was a fraud, that he was a crook, that he was a criminal. Ellen White got away with much of this stuff in a way that no one really compares to her. She is held up as this great prophet, this great saint, when in reality, she was a terribly evil person, blaspheming and doing all kinds of things. And, I don't, it's funny. Some people read the psychobiography and say, I don't see any anger there. Other people read it and say, I see a lot of anger there. I don't even know how to describe that, really, because I am angry when false prophets blaspheme God. It's not the kind of thing that causes me great joy. It does make me angry when people deceive in the name of God, when people do tragic things and attribute it to God, and when they are racist and commit it to God, and when they abuse children and tell them God hates them and commit it to God, attribute it to God. So in that sense, it does make me angry, but I'm not angry in the way that Walter Ray was, for example. When you read his book, the anger is just, and he's upfront about it because he was preaching Ellen White his whole lifetime. I can see how he was angry because he was using Ellen White as the basis of his sermons. He was an Ellen White compiler. He compiled all these books from Ellen White. He felt so betrayed when he came to find out that Ellen was a plagiarist that the anger was just overwhelming, and rightly so. You can see why, because he deceived all these people unknowingly and unwittingly because of Ellen White. That wasn't the case with me. Even when I was a kid, my dad took me aside and said, hey, she didn't always know what she was talking about. I was fortunate to have one Adventist parent who had a lot of common sense. He was a smart guy, and he didn't buy the Ellen White stuff too much, even though he wasn't a scholar. He was in the health field, and he knew what she said about masturbation. A lot of these things were completely out to lunch. So he was a nice balance to me growing up. My mom came from more conservative Adventist stock, so she never questioned Ellen White that much. But my dad was a strong skeptic of Ellen White, and I appreciated that a lot because even before I ever went into the ministry, I had a healthy skepticism about Ellen White, which most Adventists don't have typically.
So it was only a matter of time, based on what Ellen White says, that, man, you start doubting her. Eventually, you're just going to be out of here.
Yeah, especially as a kid. Of course, when my dad was a big athlete, and he tried out with the St. Louis Cardinals, and if my mom hadn't gotten pregnant with me, he probably would have played Major League Baseball. But I just absolutely was in love with sports as a kid. He raised me up with that. We had a love for sports in common. And when I got transferred to Adventist schools, that was a real downer for me because I had really excelled in the public schools, and my mom really wanted all three of us boys in Adventist schools, and my dad wasn't all that sold on it. But that really wrecked my sports future as far as becoming any kind of athlete or something. But and
I
then
think
some
I
Adventists
think
say,
that
"Oh,
I
that's
think
why he wrote the book."
well, I
Ellen
think
White
what
took
you're
away his
talking about
sports
right there
career.
has partially to do with the psychology of like Adventism
Yeah,
as it relates to even sports events. And I mean,
right.
I was very similar. I really wanted to become an amateur golfer. I was very good. But what prevented me from ever going that direction is, well, you can't play on the Sabbath. I mean, that would
Absolutely.
be, and so, yeah, there's some psychological stuff for
Yeah,
sure.
between the Sabbath and Adventist schools, there's a lot of professions that get
Yeah.
annihilated. But
Yeah.
the funny thing was, even when I was exposed to Adventism in Adventist schools, I could see it was you know, it's just not for me. This perfectionism, all this stuff I was being taught, I knew was
Yeah.
completely ridiculous, unrealistic, in my case, impossible. And so I really had no interest in Adventism at all. And I would have been voted the
Mm.
last kid to go into the ministry in my seventh, eighth grade, ninth grade classes. And then, when I was 16, I had this encounter with God where God showed me that he was nothing like the Adventist crap that I'd been
Mm.
exposed to. And that was the beginning of everything spiritual for me. I came to realize, hey, God loves me. God cares about me.
Wow.
He's nothing like this Adventist crap. And
Yeah.
so, when I went into the ministry, then it was with the hope of trying to make the church more user friendly to its young people, more gospel focused because it had a false gospel, you know, less egocentric and arrogant in its spiritual remnant stupidity and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So even going into Adventist ministry, I had very strong opinions about where Adventism was off track and stuff. And I was
Yeah.
nothing like Ray, where I bought into all this Ellen White garbage and stuff, and then found out when I was an old person that it was all garbage. It was a lie. She was a plagiarist.
Yeah.
So I understand why Ray was so angry. I've never had that same kind of anger against Adventism or Ellen White. But I do believe in the truth. One of the things you asked me was, am I coming as a critic? Am I coming as a detached historian? Am I coming as something else? And the answer would be, I'm coming as something else. I'm a gospel-centered, Christ-centered person. I believe the perfect finished work of Christ is the most important spiritual concept that exists. The greatest tragedy is people who don't accept that perfect finished work
Mm.
of Christ. And so I come from a Christ-centered, gospel-focused perspective. And, Jesus says, expose false prophets. So part of what Jesus calls us to is exposing false prophets. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
in that context that I expose what Ellen White did, not as a critic, not as a historian, although I am a trained historian and a trained psychologist.
Yeah, so good. So I want the audience to understand, because a lot of times in these types of conversations, like, well, does he have the street cred? Does he have? Yes. Well, Dr. Daly is a psychologist. He's a historian. You may not agree with his connections, or you may not agree. Whatever, that's fine. But as a historian and as a psychologist, I think you've got the the means by which to write a psychobiography of a historical person.
Right.
So
And,
so with regards to go ahead
I was
if you
going to
want.
say, and I also have the theological training. So I'm
Yes.
coming from theology just as much as I am from psychology or history.
Yeah, yeah, love that. So talk to me just a bit about, like, because most don't understand what it takes to go through the research process, like to compile the amount of information to And oftentimes people will just say like, oh yeah, I read an excerpt from Dr. Daly, whatever. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Like a lot of people just don't understand the amount of time, effort, the amount of research, what you had to go to develop what it is that you have. So what was the biggest challenging aspect of researching Ellen White's life and writings?
Yeah, I mean, psychologists are trained in research methods like few other disciplines. When you have a PhD in psychology, like I do, you take tons of research methods classes. You're trained in research, statistics, research methods. These things are just abundant coursework. And so most, even academics who try to diminish my research skills haven't had near the training and research that I have. That doesn't mean that I'm trying to come across as some super meticulous researcher. That's not really my goal. My goal is to try to speak the truth in an interesting way that will be based on factual information to the best of our degree. When we talk about history, we really never talk about absolutes or absolute facts. We talk about probability. History is always based on probability. What is the probability that these sources and source documents are adequate to the conclusions being drawn? And you know we're psychologists are trained in that far more than most disciplines. And so I don't apologize at all for the amount of research courses I've had to take. And again, I still want my writing to not be boring. I don't want it to be some high academic stuff that people say, forget this garbage. I want it to be interesting and engaging, but still based on good historical documentation. That's why I have so many footnotes in the psychobiography, that many of them are very extensive. But academics are a weird bunch. Having worked with them for 24 years at Loma Linda University, 4 of those years were exclusively with Loma Linda and not with La Sierra. But anyway, I was teaching during that entire period, and academics are an interesting bunch. I was a campus chaplain as well as a faculty member, and I was teaching 2 courses a quarter rather than 3. So I wasn't 100% full time. And I won Teacher of the Year one year there. And some academics were really ticked about that. Hey, this guy's just a part-time teacher. How is he winning Teacher of the Year on our university campus? And so there's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of nitpicking. You mentioned McAdams, reading a chapter of my book and saying it was garbage. Any academic who would admit to doing that is not really an academic. You read one chapter of a book and you dismiss it on the basis of that chapter. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous in and of itself.
By the way, McAdams he only read the first chapter is what he said. So,
yeah.
I mean, I don't have a lot of respect for someone that just picks up a book, reads the first chapter, and they're like, oh, whatever. I mean,
yeah. I mean, and that first chapter wasn't even polemical at all. I would admit that the book is a polemic. I'm certainly making an argument there. And Numbers himself, who was on my reading committee, said it's a powerful polemic. There's a place for polemic. And Numbers' book wasn't particularly a polemic. I think there was a great place for his book written as it was written at the time it was written. And I think my book at the time it was written, there was a place for the polemic that I engage in.
mm-hmm.
But polemic doesn't mean non-scholarly. It simply means that you're making an argument that might not be the conventional argument that's accepted out there, which is certainly the case with Adventism.
And it's funny because my understanding, I would take that as a big honor, because much of the Old Testament is written as a polemic against
Absolutely.
a lot of stuff that was going on during that time. And so,
yeah, the prophetic culture is a polemical culture. I mean, anyone who understands prophetic, and not to slap back at Adams, but I just don't respect the guy much because he had great information way back in the 70s and sat on it. And, he's always been
Yeah.
more concerned about his career than the truth. And I just don't
Yeah.
respect that. I have great respect for Numbers and Ray and Ford and the people that stand up for truth. I have great respect for, but someone who
Yeah.
sits back and is a coward, I don't respect that. And I
Yeah.
consider McAdams to be a coward.
Yeah. So, well, let's move into. I want to talk a little bit about Ellen White, specifically in your book, The Psychobiography. You kind of address her as a high functioning sociopath.
Hmm.
And so we're not going to try to ask Ellen White to join us today with using that green cord that she suggested.
Right.
But but I did put her on the screen just so she could be hearing you
All right,
while
good.
you're having this conversation. um, but my question is this: do you seriously believe that Ellen G. White was one of the most successful con artists in religious history?
Well, con artist is something different than plagiarist. I definitely believe she was the most successful plagiarist in human history. Con artist is a bigger category, and there were a lot of great con artists out there to compare her to. So I wouldn't make that claim that she was the greatest con artist in history. Um, but I certainly believe she was the most successful plagiarist in history. And a plagiarist is a con artist in the sense that they're stealing from others and passing it off. They're a certain category of con artist, if you will. So
Yeah.
when we look at the category of plagiarist, I do believe she was the most successful plagiarist in all of human history, which is a pretty major claim for a person to have. And
Yeah.
again, I don't hate Ellen White like people accuse me of. I've often said I hope she is in heaven because I have so many questions I want to ask her. Um, I'm tragically sad at how she's deceived so many people and hurt so many people and carried out a legacy that is so tragic in terms of evil. But I wouldn't question God if Ellen White was in heaven. He knows what he's doing, and I don't question him. But I don't really anticipate she'll be in heaven because there's no evidence that she ever repented of her deceptions and all of her stuff. And
Yeah.
I just think she was evil right up to the end, even in her will and everything else. Her establishment of the White estate, it's all evil stuff.
Well, she didn't like what you said. She left the screen, so I'm not sure.
But yeah, I don't
So
think she'll want to hang out with me in heaven.
maybe she'll be a changed woman at that point,
Yes,
right?
she would have to be, I
Um,
would think.
so you mentioned in your book, you and I believe you use this phrase high functioning sociopath, or
Yes,
and you may use, I don't know if you use specifically narcissism, but I know that you've talked
yes,
about, like, high functioning, narcissist or sociopath.
yes.
Um, how, like, what were the patterns as you were doing this research? What kind of uncovered that way of thinking of her? Because that's the first time I've actually heard someone, when I was reading your book, kind of state her in, or kind of claim that
Yeah, I
perspective of
have two
her.
chapters towards the end of the book that go into great detail about her being a narcissistic personality, fitting with a narcissistic personality disorder. And I try to be careful here when we talk about diagnoses because it's not considered ethical for a psychologist to diagnose a person that they've never had as a client or a person who's dead without ever having that person as a client. This is one of the things I brought up about the revised copy of Numbers, you know, Prophetess of Health. His wife, who's a mental health a licensed professional, does some diagnosing with him in that book. And I don't disagree with their conclusions about Ellen White being guilty of major depression, histrionic personality disorder, um, somatization, somatic personality disorder. I think they're right on in their assessments, But for them to come right out and say, we're diagnosing her with this, I did take issue with that because that goes against the code of ethics for psychologists and for mental health professionals. Having said that, I'm very careful in those 2 chapters when I not only agree with the basic concepts that, are shared in Numbers in their second revised book, but I add to that narcissistic personality disorder in great detail, going through every single category and showing historically how Ellen matches up to every single one of the categories. You only need like 5 of the 9 to be diagnosed, but I show historically she fits perfectly with every single one of them. I say I leave it up to you as the reader to decide if this is an accurate diagnosis or not. I'm not going to make the diagnosis because it's not considered ethical, but I'm showing you the historical evidence, and I'm showing you the categories that are the criteria for the diagnosis, and she fits every one from my perspective. You decide for yourself if that's true. And I did the same thing with the high functioning sociopathic perspective. Again, she fits every single one of the categories remarkably. You can just look at the historical evidence, which I do, and I say, look at this, for yourself and decide for yourself. Is that a proper diagnosis for her or not? You're a layperson. You can make the diagnosis. I can't make the diagnosis because I'm a professional. But if I could, I certainly would, based on the evidence, because it's extremely powerful evidence.
Yeah. I would concur. And it would be interesting. When I read your kind of 2 chapters and kind of the diagnosis and the layout, it jogged my memory of one of the other books that I was cautioned not to read was Canwright's book. And I frantically went back and flipped through and was reading it's not that long. It's a couple of pages where he lays out kind of what it was like being in the room with the whites on a Sabbath afternoon with someone that disagreed with her, and how they would grill her, or they would grill the church member that kind of disagreed. They called it verbal waterboarding, basically. And so it's like, that kind of, there's a problem mentally with someone that has to force someone to agree with them before they leave and set off on a different place.
Yeah, all you have to do is see how she treats her doubters. It doesn't matter who they are. They're of the devil. They're completely of perdition. I mean, she doesn't take any prisoners once someone's made up their mind that she's to be questioned. It's all over for that person.
Yep. All right, so that gives us a good segue. I want to spend some time talking about plagiarism. So, was Ellen White's alleged literary theft, would you consider it addictive? Like, was she addicted to it, where she couldn't stop doing it? It was for fear of getting caught, or how would you explain how she managed this whole escape from public exposure? And I don't think she thought that the internet would ever, well, I know she didn't think anything about the internet because it was not even functioning then, but time seems to have exposed much of this. But how would you kind of piece that all together? I mean, was she addicted to it? Was it part of her narcissistic behavior? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and one of the most important questions, given that she is the most successful serial plagiarist in all of history. And it really starts long before she engaged in what we would call literary plagiarism, where she's taking books and copying from those books. And she was not an original thinker from the very beginning. She is a person who soaks up stuff from whatever subculture she's in and learns how to elevate herself in that subculture in quite a remarkable way. But even after her injury, it's amazing how she's able to manipulate her whole family through that injury, what I call creative malady. And, never goes back to school again. They tried to get her back a couple times, but no, she's found a much better life, a life of entitlement, a life where she's not subjected to female roles or traditional roles. She's a special person now, and she really takes and runs with that specialness, if you will. It's a sense of not just entitlement, but I the cover of my psychobiography is basically pointing out, here's this little cat looking up at this great lion, and the cat's assuming in the mirror that she's that great lion, which is the case with Ellen White. She makes herself out to be God, and it's delusional. This is the essence of delusional thinking. And Ellen White, at a very early age, and what happened, even before the rock accident, we don't really know for sure. We do know she had these really weird, bizarre fears when she was 8 years old, where she wanted to die, but she was afraid to die because she was sure she was lost. And she had all these abnormal fears, which are not typical of an 8-year-old at all. Nothing to do with her family system, nothing to do with her other 8 siblings or her other 7 siblings. And, we have to ask the question, where in the heck did this come from? Where did she get these bizarre, weird fears? And, it's either something that's very unique to her, or it has some kind of demonic stuff tied to it. Many times little children are encapsulated with the devil early on. They're spiritually vulnerable, and the devil can choose his early on many times. And I really think that that was the case, very likely the case with Ellen White, that she had all these abnormal fears because she was exposed to demonic spirits that gave her a spirit of fear. That's just my guess. I didn't put that in the psychobiography because it was written from a historical kind of perspective. But I really do believe that it wasn't just her own doing that led to these incredible fears that she had. And she had this ridiculous fear, not only fear, but drive and passion to be somebody, especially after the accident, and she really climbs up the ladder in the Shouting Methodist community, which is one heck of a bizarre cultic community when you study it. It's really fascinating that she gains a place of leadership as an early teen. It's fascinating to study that dynamic. And then she gains a major place after she's kicked out of the Methodist Church for her Millerism. She gains a prominent place in Millerism as a teenager, mid-teenager. She's given a high position that is quite fascinating to study. Most Adventists are completely ignorant of this. And I was even ignorant of this when I wrote the psychobiography. I didn't realize that there was a whole charismatic strain of Millerism in Portland, Maine. I knew that, Miller himself was very anti-charismatic, and so were the major leaders of Millerism. So I always thought, hey, Ellen White couldn't have been that influential. But in Portland, Maine, there was a very charismatic group of Millerites, and Ellen gained great prominence through her visionary claims in that movement. So even before she claimed her first Adventist vision at the age of 17, she had already learned how to climb her way up in these kinds of subcultures as a young teenager, and a woman on top of it. It is really quite remarkable that you really have to ask, hey, did she have someone helping her out there like the devil? There's a lot there to think about. But anyway, my point is that when you get to plagiarism, Ellen White's not a creative thinker. She's not an original thinker. She doesn't come up with anything herself. She always takes other people's stuff, and then she claims that she's validating it through visions. That's her constant thing. And she did that in Millerism. She did that in the Shouting Methodists. She does that in Adventism. And of course, Bates and her husband are the ones who are calling all the shots in early Adventism. So she's taken all of her stuff from them. The shut door, all this stuff she's getting from them. And then it's proven to be complete stupidity. She goes 7 years here having all these visions that are supposedly straight from God that are all proven to be a complete lie and a complete joke. And even all of her date setting stuff that happened during that period. So, Ellen realizes, hey, I got to broaden my scope here. I'm not doing too well with my husband and Bates. Of course, they both came out of the Christian Connection movement, which was a total cult itself. So they had all these cultic ideas that she was borrowing and attributing to God. And so Uriah Smith, then becomes prominent. He becomes editor of the Review in 1855. And she starts borrowing a lot of his stuff. That's where she really starts her plagiarism, is with Uriah Smith, and starts to realize, hey, I can take his stuff and attribute it to God and get a lot of leverage out of it. And so she starts doing that kind of stuff. And by the time the 60s get there, she realizes, hey, why confine myself to Adventists? Why not? She's getting big into health reform. And both Bates and her husband are subscribing to all this health reform literature, as Numbers points out, that she denied ever having read, even though it's verbatim quotes from it. And so she starts realizing that she can, steal from all these health reform authors and claim God showed her this stuff in vision and get a lot of leverage out of it, which she, of course, did. And she just follows that pattern the rest of her life. And, you ask if it's an addiction or not. Well, addiction, of course, is a interesting word to study. There's some biological addictions. There's some addictions that are more emotional and psychological. But she was certainly addicted to it, and that she had gained great power and prestige through doing this. And if she gave it up, she had no resources. She had no sources to draw on. So it was only because of her plagiarism that she was able to come up with the content. The only content she came up with that wasn't just plagiarized content from other authors was her individual rebukes of people. She just plain made those visions up. She didn't have to plagiarize something to tell Canwright God showed her he was going to hell and he was of the devil. And once you became public enemy number one for Ellen, she became quite creative at that point. Everything she hated about you, God showed her in vision, and it was even read in front of the church in many cases. But it's fascinating to just think of what was like an everyday life in Ellen White's life. I believe she got up early. She went up to her little room where she's supposedly praying and getting downloads from God, when the reality was she was carefully going through materials, books, trying to disguise her plagiarism. She goes out of her way in her messy manuscripts to try to disguise, even to, Fanny Bolton and Marion Davis. She deceives them about how much plagiarizing she's doing, and she carefully orchestrates that. It's just gross premeditated immorality. Adventists like to say, oh, God showed her this stuff apart from the books and vision. No, that's a complete lie. This is gross premeditated immorality where she's stealing, hiding it, disguising it, deceiving her own assistants, subjecting them to potential liability and lawsuits. I mean, the woman just has no scruples. She's got no conscience. She's willing to hang anybody out to dry for her own sake. She's just a very self-seeking, self-serving human being.
Yeah, I think of, I didn't realize until, well into a couple of these critics' books, yours along with Numbers and some others, that women during the Victorian era that had, normally women weren't thought of that, in a certain way inside the Victorian area, unless they were weak and had visions, and then they became some sort of special mystical,
Yeah.
connection, so to speak.
Ann Tave's book on the trances really brings that out.
Yep. So that really helped me kind of put some of this together. But what fascinates me is if Ellen didn't have visions, her writings wouldn't mean anything.
Absolutely.
And if Ellen didn't have any writings, but all she had is visions, like it's like this perfect trifecta. Like she was weak, she was a female, weak, and then had writings that now she could ascribe to God. That perfect trifecta made her almost in the Victorian era untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like, anyways. That's at least my perspective. I don't know what your
Yeah.
thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, she really is untouchable in the sense that psychologically, the people are so devastated coming out of the Millerite disappointment that they're on the verge of suicide, and many of them did commit suicide. So they're as desperate as the human beings can possibly be. And Ellen takes advantage of this desperation. She manipulates them. She gives them some kind of hope in this desperation. And, so anyone who sees the truth, Lucinda Burdick or Grant or any of these people that speak up, the emotional investment, the cognitive dissonance is so great with her followers that she can do stuff that's just absolutely ridiculous in terms of what she writes about the shut door, what she writes about the date setting. This stuff is just so ridiculous. You have to ask, how can people hold on to this woman after she's so obviously wrong in these areas? But their investment was so absolute. She had given them hope. She had given them life when they had no hope and they had no life. Yeah. And so her being a prophet was tied to their very sense of life and sense of existence. And so it didn't matter how ridiculous the criticism, even Ellen telling them to sell their homes when she uses the money to buy her own first home. I mean, that kind of stuff would tick off most people. And there were a few that saw what was going on and did leave, the whole messenger party.
They were ticked off.
Yeah, there were several that did leave. But
and then Ellen White writes all kinds of crazy stuff against them, right? Like, I mean,
yeah, absolutely. That was another thing. If you're going to speak out against this woman, you better be prepared to be spiritually assassinated. I mean, you're going to get annihilated, and it's all going to be from visions from God. So most people aren't up to that. They don't want to put up with that.
It is interesting that and I'm not saying this is necessarily unique to Adventism, but it is interesting in Adventism. I have met some staunch Ellen White-ers that like to engage in a, like, God told me this.
Yeah.
They like to engage. It's almost like a pathology, right? That because they're so absorbed in this kind of thinking that they have to use God's power of authority to force their way of thinking on other people.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate. It's sad. And I get to your original statement. I get why you would be upset with that kind of misuse of God's divine power.
Yeah.
So, we have, and by the way, I'm sure that we have some staunch Ellen White defenders watching now. The common charge that I get in engaging the likes of like Judd Lake and Kevin Morgan, and I'm naming those because they're the more recent ones. Again, I'm not saying anything negative against them per se, but the common response is, well, Mike, Dr. Daly, you just don't understand. I mean, that she was doing common literary borrowing. This was like common during her time to do what she did. She wasn't really a plagiarist. She was just doing what was allowed during that time. How would you respond to something like that?
Yeah, I respond to that in my book, of course, but it's the review in the 1860s that takes people to task for plagiarizing from them. The Adventist Review is very, very clear about don't be using our stuff without permission and without acknowledging it. And of course, Ellen White copyrights all her books, which is quite interesting. When you're a plagiarist, you're copywriting all the stuff you plagiarize from other people, and you're holding people accountable for copying your stuff of the stuff you copied from others. So they knew good and well it was wrong. Ellen White wouldn't have gone to the great strides she went to disguise the plagiarism in her manuscripts if she thought it was okay. It was obvious she knew it wasn't okay. And when Fanny started blowing the whistle on her, she lowers the boom on Fanny because she knows it's not okay. And everyone else knows it's not okay. It's obviously not the level of legal society that we have today. But Connie Barrenhausen threatened to sue him over sketches from the life of Paul. And I mean, there's just no way a reasonable person can try to make that argument that it was somehow innocent, that it was somehow acceptable, that everyone was doing it. That's either gross historical ignorance or just deliberate dishonesty. I don't know which, but
yeah, I remember doing some on a Sabbath afternoon. What a great time to do this kind of research. I was still an Adventist at the time, and I remember happening to fall into a website that archives all the old newspaper articles that you can go back into the 80s and 90s and like look at all this stuff. And it was almost like I got giddy when I found like one article and it was talking about Ellen White. Well, for hours, I sat there clipping articles from, all these different, news outlets that were talking about Ellen White. And some of the things that surprised me is there were allegations of fraud back then in the newspaper articles.
Yeah.
I mean, like stealing money and like doing things fraudulently. And that just was like, whoa, how come people today don't talk about it? How come Adventists today don't talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, all the publications that were put out by the groups that left, Messenger Party and all these, of course, they all documented in print the financial fraud and all kinds of stuff. But Adventists dismissed all that as, oh, those people are all apostates and they're all haters and they don't speak the truth. And you get to the Hillsburg newspaper, which is the first secular newspaper in 1889, to come right out and say Ellen G. White was a plagiarist. Here's a bunch of evidence for it. And that had a lot to do with them sending Ellen out of the country to Australia, because the heat was coming on now that it was in the public press. And if there's one thing Adventists can't stand, it's for the truth to be out there in the public press. They want to keep everything insular, in-house, isolated from the mainline culture. They want to not be exposed in the mainline culture above all things. So that was a real trauma for them when that came out in the Hillsburg newspaper.
So you mentioned, and I'm glad you brought this up. So you mentioned, many may not know that Ellen White was kind of sent away. She was asked to go to Australia.
Right.
And that was after she had made, and I know many Adventist defenders like to point out, well, Ellen White never physically made a date for Jesus coming. I get that. I understand she didn't. I think that was intentional. I think she knew that if she did give a physical day,
I mean, it all depends on how you define that, right? It all depends on how you define it. If I say the Lord's going to return by the end of April in 2026, then the last day of April, I've set a date. And Ellen White did that in 1845 in the spring, and she did it again in September. So that was a literal day setting. By the last day of those 2 months, she had said the Lord would return by that time. She also said the Lord showed her the day and the hour of his return in her first Adventist vision, which of course was a lie as well. But, she has many situations where she is specifically setting a time. You have 3 months left before the probation closes. That's setting a time in 1849, 1850. She's setting a specific time that probation will close and the time of trouble will begin in the next few months. So, the 1856 vision about some will be translated who are in this room, they all die, and everyone's saying, hey, what happened? By 1906, they were following her carefully, that every single person in that room, at least one of them was going to be translated because she saw it in vision. No, it was all a lie. There are many, many cases where if it's not saying Jesus is going to return on July 13, it's certainly violating this date setting concept in Scripture. She does it all the time, even in the 1880s. It's too late to get married. It's too late to have children. All kinds of stuff like this, where she's violating that concept of date setting.
And I'm glad you're bringing these things out, because I've even had recent dialogue. While it's an important dialogue to talk about the plagiarism charges, it's absolutely a moot point if she's a false prophetess.
Right.
And I do want people to understand that however you determine, what are the requirements for someone to be a true prophet. I know that some will disagree on certain points, whatever. But one is prophesying something and it not happening. And I think this date setting aspect is something that Adventists really have to understand, that this woman, not just once, but multiple times, claimed that Christ was coming.
Yes.
And it didn't happen. That deems her a false prophetess.
Absolutely. And it's not just being a false prophetess, but it's stripping people of their money and their own homes in the name of being a false prophet. It's one thing to be stupid and believe the Lord's going to return a certain time. It's another thing to specifically defraud people of their homes and their possessions, and then to turn around and use that money for your own self-benefit. I mean, this is the stuff that we consider absolute scum of the earth doing. And she did that stuff in the name of God, which Adventists are never willing to own up to, but the historical evidence is absolutely overwhelming. There's really no getting around it. And it happened repeatedly. She was doing this her whole lifetime. To what degree was she primarily motivated by money? That can be a debate. But there's no question that money was a big thing to her and to James both, and that they defrauded their own flock throughout their lifetimes, even to the point of committing major embezzlement. And Ellen justifies James' major embezzlement through visions. I mean, come on. It's just so disgusting when you look at it, that for people to try to justify that kind of immorality in the name of God's great last day prophet, it really is disgusting. It really should produce anger in people, because it's a disgusting thing.
Yeah, prior to, most of my life, many people probably watching, you might know my personal testimony. If not, I would encourage you to watch it. It's in one of the playlists on my channel. But I was an Adventist for 42 years, my whole life, grown up, third, fifth generation Adventist, raised in every schooling all the way through college. I don't have any kind of education outside of, the Adventist system. My dad was a conservative Adventist pastor, career Adventist pastor out of Michigan. Like, I think I understand what it's like to be an Adventist. I think, okay, I don't know if I missed anything. But I remember, I didn't know, I was taught that Ellen White, that her weakness was that God worked through her because of her weakness.
Right.
I was told that Ellen White she was not a wealthy woman, that she died penniless. I was told these things.
She died in debt. Millions of dollars in debt in our money today.
But what happened? Like, who paid that debt? Like, how did, like, did she really not have a financial legacy?
I mean, it's really fascinating to study her life just strictly from a financial standpoint. Dirk
Yeah.
Anderson's done a fair amount of this, and I love the book Desire of Wages. It's just a booklet, but it's a very good book on Ellen White's exploitation of financial things. But I've studied it quite a bit, and the woman was her and James were both snake oil salesmen. I mean, they were selling trinkets and dress patterns, and I mean, they made more than $1 million in our money just from selling hymnals to the church. They didn't write those hymnals. They didn't have anything to do with getting credit for those hymnals. They just exploited their flocks and made money off them by selling them these hymnals. I mean, Ken Wright is so right about how they had their old, outdated books that were worthless and they were stuck with them all. And James came up with the idea, hey, we can make the church buy all these from us and give them to the mission field. And they were about as much snake oil salesman as you can get, with all the trinkets, charts. You look at how many things they were selling in the churches as they made the rounds to all these churches. And they were making a fortune, and then living very high on the hog. They had a very lavish lifestyle that included spas, world travel. Ellen had a huge entourage that only got larger and larger as she lived longer and longer and had more sense of entitlement. But, the way they pulled off the debt thing was, first of all, no one would question them. James was on the board of the SAN. He was on the board of the Review. So, I'm just borrowing this 5,000, which happened to be about 200 to 250,000 in our money today. I'm just borrowing this. I'll get it back to you. Never had any intention of getting it back to him till he's on his deathbed and Kellogg's threatening him. Oh, yeah. Here it is. He gives it back and then he miraculously recovers and demands the money back. I mean, the guy is just a scumbag. But and then Ellen has a vision. Oh no, this is justified. But the church then has to give all that money back to Kellogg after James dies because he has the absolute documentation, and they can't dispute it. He's gonna blow the whistle on them legally and in front of the whole general conference. So they cave in and give him all the money because they know he's right. He has the documentation. Ellen and James, they had, at least 10 different houses. I enjoyed Dirk's last book on the spirit of hypocrisy because he shows pictures of most of these houses in the book. And many of them were mansions. The Italian mansion that burned down in Battle Creek, that was a mansion, 16-room mansion with a huge amount of property. And they had houses all over the country, vacation homes. They're traveling all over the world. They have an entourage. I mean, you can't live like that. She had 14 people with her just in Australia, buys another home there. I mean, it's just ridiculous the way these people spend money on photography. All the stuff she condemns, they were spending big time money on. And beautiful, lavish wardrobe, jewelry, all the stuff she condemns, she owned in large quantities at the most expensive kinds of levels, and Adventists have kept it all quiet.
Yeah,
they're colluding, they're enabling, what Ellen White did, and it's just really tragic that the church, of course, they're all invested in this. If the bubble pops, they all lose their income and their influence and everything else. So, I don't
well,
care if it's
would Adventism even exist? I mean, let's just hypothesize for a second. If they finally did right the ship and they recanted from Ellen White, which I would be surprised that I would ever live to the day that would happen. But if that were to happen and they got rid of Ellen White, like would Adventism be anything unique?
Absolutely not. It's nothing unique except for its delusional claims of being the remnant and having the true
Yeah.
last day prophet. All the things that are easily proven to be false. I mean, it's got nothing unique to offer the Christian community that's above board or that's healthy or that's positive. It's all delusional, self-serving kind of stuff that's unique to Adventism,
Yeah.
including the Sabbath, which is nothing but idolatry, and completely out of harmony with what Scripture teaches. Adventists have never understood the gospel, even though J.H. Wagner had a good understanding of it in 1854 when he wrote his book on the law of God. Well, that's really striking to me that that was shot down because of Ellen's vision. The church leaders didn't like it because he was basically saying the law of God in Galatians and Romans is the moral law. That's what was done away with, is the whole law of Moses, the whole thing, moral, Ten Commandments, the whole business. And obviously, this was very threatening to their Sabbath doctrine. So Smith and James and all the big boys gang up on Wagner and say this book has to come out off the market. And then they appeal to Ellen on this, and she, of course, has a vision that confirms that they're right and Wagner's wrong. And this is the basic gospel we're talking about here. Adventists, James and Bates had no clue of the true gospel. The Christian connection was as legalistic and perfectionistic, anti-Trinitarian, didn't believe Jesus was God. I mean, they were as cultic and off the wall as you can get. And so they were in no position to judge the true gospel. And Wagner and Jones simply echo what Wagner's dad had taught back in 1854, in 1888. That's what they're teaching, is that the law in Galatians and Romans was the moral law, the whole thing, and it was all nailed to the cross. And Ellen, of course, just picks and chooses the part she wants from that message that she saw was very popular with the masses, which was the righteousness by faith component. And she latches onto that and says, oh boy, I got some great books coming here. And, it Steps to Christ and Desire of Ages and Mount of Blessing and Christ Object Lessons. All those flow out of that. Not a one of them understands the true gospel. Not a one of them understands what Wagner and Jones were saying about the law of God at the 88 conference.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason Ellen was shipped off to Australia wasn't just because the plagiarism was being exposed in the public press. It was because she had completely betrayed Butler and Smith. Butler was the GC president, Smith was the review editor, and they knew good and well that Ellen had had this vision back in 1854, and they were using that to condemn Wagner and Jones. And Ellen said, yeah, you guys are right. Wagner and Jones are wrong, but we don't want to have this fighting in the church. But you're right, and they're wrong. So immediately when she says that, they go to the press, and Butler writes a book, and Smith puts in the review, Ellen endorses us, we're right. And Ellen was so pissed off about this because they just defied her. It was in your face, Ellen. We're going to tell everybody you said we're right. And she was so angry about that she said, okay, I'm going to get you back, and I'm going to let Wagner and Jones have a primary pulpit at the general conference to do their thing. And then she saw how popular it was, and she's having visions of more books coming out of this message, although she never accepts the true message that Wagner and Jones were preaching, which Adventism has never gotten the gospel straight. Brinsmead's book, Judged by the Gospel, basically tells it like it is.
It is interesting how people that cross paths with Ellen White, either they recognize her power that she has. So like if they can, it's almost like if they can touch the hem of her skirt, and like latch on to this power that has been given to her, that, oh no, she agrees with me. And so now look at,
Right,
it's
right.
like this big power struggle. which is in and of itself so contrary to like Jesus and what Jesus did when he was on this earth and how he functioned as a,
Absolutely.
you know, as a teacher. I feel like this is a good. There's two things I want to talk before we move out of the plagiarism thing. I forget how to say the guy's name. Is it Dr. 14? Is that how you say it? How?
Yeah, I've only read his name. I don't know him personally, but I've heard it pronounced 14. I've heard it pronounced Fortin. I'm not the person to ask how you properly pronounce his name, but
I mean, it
I am
sounds
very
cooler
familiar with some of his
to say
writings.
14. So we'll just say 14. It sounds
Yeah,
cooler.
14 is how I had pronounced it.
But many here may not be aware of his work. He's done extensive work. And one of the things, and I don't want to get hung up on like the percentages because I think people, that can be a red herring that people go off into the weeds on. But I was surprised to find out, and Dr. 14 like validated this for me, that Milton's Paradise Lost is extensively used by Ellen White in one of her books. Tell a little bit about In Great Controversy. So, like, do you believe that to be true? Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I was
being
surprised about
dishonest,
the
or?
80 to 90% figure that I read from 14. That seemed high to me, but I haven't examined Great Controversy and all the sources the way he has, nor did I come close to doing what McAdams did with that particular publication. But what I do know is that she borrowed a great deal from Uriah Smith in that publication. She borrowed from many other sources. So I would be surprised if it was as high as 80 to 90%. But it doesn't really matter. Like you say, the statistic of how much is actually plagiarized was pointed out very clearly by Veltman to not really be important. Adventists jumped on his 31% thing. Oh, only 31% was plagiarized. Well, what was his conclusion? That it all was derived and not creative, not original. It all was derived from other sources. And so she derived her content, and then she tried to expound on that derivative material. And that's exactly what she did in Great Controversy, what she did in Desire of Ages, what she does in any book that contains history or theology. She always derived her content from others that she plagiarized from. And who cares which book got the most of her plagiarism? I don't really care. All I know is Veltman's conclusion is accurate, that she derived everything when it came to historical content, theological content. It wasn't any of her original thinking or creative thinking. She was not a theologian. She was not a historian. She wasn't an original thinker. She wasn't even a creative thinker, unless it came to having visions about her enemies. Then she could get pretty creative and just making up stuff. But when it came to historical content, theological content, anything like that, she always stole from other sources, be they Adventist or non-Adventist. And that's the important thing, that not only that she stole, but then that she attributed it all to God. That's what's really disgusting, when you steal and then attribute it to God. That's the last straw. And that's what she did continually, was attribute all of her stuff, whether she made it up condemning Canwright or whether she was writing Great Controversy. She stole it all, and she derived it all from other places except her personal attacks. And then she attributed it all to God. That's what's really disgusting. I mean, you got to really be blasphemer to do something like that.
Yeah, I want to, because you've brought this up, this is actually taken from the Veltman study. I'm going to throw this on the screen for everyone to see here. And I apologize, this is last minute, so it kind of doesn't make sense on the screen well. This is a screenshot from a buddy of mine. I'm going to leave his name anonymous. But I just want you to read, when the Ellen White writings are evaluated against the practices of other writings of this period and genre, instead of against the expectations of those who put Ellen White as a writer in a special category, the question of plagiarism becomes a much more complicated issue. And then he goes on, another question often raised in connection with the plagiarism issue has to do with Ellen White's denial of literary borrowing. Adventists have asked on how I personally solved the problem. This is Veltman. Did I think the introductory statement in Great Controversy, which is what we're talking about, constituted an adequate admission of literary dependence? And this is the important paragraph I want people to hear. I must admit that I find the Great Controversy preface much too limited to answer for all of Ellen White's use of sources. The statement comes rather late in her history of writing. It is too narrow and perhaps too vague in its reference to historians and reformers in, it's hard for me to read that, the use of success, and it does not cover her practice of paraphrasing her sources. So that's in the that's near the end of his. Again, you'll see that how many pages there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Veltman obviously had to be careful. He was still an Adventist employee, and I was thrilled when they chose Veltman because he was my freshman Greek teacher, and he was one of the few no nonsense professors I ever had. I often wondered, how does this guy survive in Adventism? And then they choose him to do this study, and I'm thinking, holy Toledo, they're going to get it. And sure enough, he tells it like it is. The derivative thing says it all to me. And then he's kind of pulling his punches, on her immorality here. He's saying that's the major question, obviously, but he doesn't want to come right out and say she's a fraud and an immoral pig. But, it's the bottom line is, that's what he knows based on the fact that everything's derivative. It's all attributed to God. None of it came from God. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to draw the conclusions from that this is an immoral person who's doing this stuff.
So this brings up an interesting segue into, because as you talked about Veltman, I mean, you have to be very careful what you say, to still to still have a job and get paid by the tithe payers of the Adventist church. So to what extent, let's talk about fraud and cover up for a second. And when I say cover up, I'm talking, because I know that your White Estate, I've got both these books sitting here. I know that this particular book I was fascinated to read this one, because this is, no one's done a book like this.
Right.
And so I applaud you for it, number one. And I found it very fascinating to really see the extent of intentional cover up by White. Yeah. And then from there, by extension, all these other leaders, like the 1919 conference and what happened with that whole thing. And and it still happens today. Yeah. It seems to be happening today, not just with regards to Ellen White, but even other stuff that goes on. So to what extent do you hold Adventist leaders, responsible for, if you know this stuff, why are you not speaking up? Why are you just taking a paycheck?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like I say to Butler and other Adventist historians, Grable, etc. They're all people that will say, "Oh, we knew all that stuff that was in your psychobiography," and I go, "Oh, really? Then why didn't you ever say anything about it? Why didn't you write about it? Why didn't you document it in your own writings?" I mean, it's a catch-22 for them. If they knew it, why did they keep it secret and quiet? And in many cases, they didn't know a lot of that stuff. I didn't know a lot of that stuff, even though I taught Adventist history for many years, until I made that my focal point as a research question. And this is something people often don't understand about research. A person might think, oh, you have a PhD in history, or you have a PhD in psychology, therefore you know everything about these subjects. That's a complete joke. I mean, psychology is such a broad field that whatever narrow area you have a PhD in, you're still completely grossly ignorant about these other areas. And even in the area of your PhD, there's stuff you don't always know. And, that's the case with every discipline. Yeah, their knowledge is so infinite, and Jesus Christ is absolute truth. That's what I try to emphasize. A lot of people in academia and elsewhere today say there is no such thing as absolute truth. Well, that's nonsense. If you don't have any concept of absolute truth, then there's no point in talking to you. There has to be a sense of frame of reference to even have a discussion. And none of us as fallen human beings have absolute truth, but we sure better understand that there is such a thing as absolute truth. And we better know what the source of that is that we can be looking to. And Jesus Christ said, I am truth. No debate about it. And that's why the devil's working so hard to get people to not believe Jesus was God, not believe he's absolute truth, not believe in his perfect finished work. But I believe in those things 100%. And that's really what drives me, is the gospel of Jesus Christ and the exposure of false gospels and false religion and false prophets. And that's precisely what Ellen White is. She is just very clearly a false prophet in every way, shape, and form.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit scary. At least my experience being in Adventism my whole life is that it's actually subtly scary, because the version of the gospel, many people inside the Adventist church would be surprised that you would even say that they have a false gospel,
Right.
like, because that's not my Adventism. That's not what I have ran into some Adventists. I won't share names, but a lady that used to study with us here at the house, after we left the Adventist church, she was a reasonably new Adventist that moved into the area. She had gone well over 4 or 5 years as an Adventist, didn't even know who Ellen White was.
Yeah, that's amazing.
How do you become a part of a movement that is dependent, and it's even in the doctrinal teachings? It's a part of your baptismal vows.
Right.
Like, how do you do that? Like, isn't that dishonest?
Yeah, I mean, Adventism has become so pluralistic as to be meaningless, really. I mean, I know left-wingers who don't believe in God, don't believe God exists. They certainly don't believe Jesus was God. And they're Adventists in good standing today. It's just so ridiculous when you look at the spectrum of Adventists, from absolute perfectionists who worship Ellen White to the most extreme leftists you can possibly find who have taken over AT and Spectrum today. And it's really a joke to have a community that is this pluralistic and yet making the claims for itself that it does, which are very specific. 28 fundamental beliefs and all this kind of stuff. It's a bunch of garbage. They make no attempt to enforce those 28 fundamental beliefs on their academics, especially. It's a complete joke.
Not until you start speaking out against them. If you verbally speak out against them, then they will definitely.
Right. Like if you're a Ford and says the investigative judgment isn't biblical, then they'll have a glacier view. Even though almost all the academics there agreed with Ford, it was a total witch hunt. But I one of the things I talked about in terms of Adventist Ellen's true legacy is that not only is the gospel number one, a false gospel, that's the number one legacy. I talk about how Jesus said a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. So a person has to decide whether Ellen White was a bad tree or not. And I don't know how a person can possibly look at all the evidence from her lifetime and not determine that she was a bad tree. That doesn't mean good things didn't come out of it. Every good thing comes from God. There's a lot of good things that have come out of Adventism and even Ellen White's books, because God overcomes evil with good. And God brings good out of evil, and God brings even good out of some cults. And God is great at overcoming evil with good. But we need to give God the credit for the good, not Ellen White. This contrived legacy that Ellen White was this great nation builder of institutions, health, medical, educational, missionary, this wonderful, great builder. That's all garbage. She was a false gospel. She had a tragic legacy. Whatever good has come out of it, God needs to get the credit and the glory. None of it goes to Ellen White or Adventism. But Adventism does have to take responsibility for its lies, evil, cover-ups, its laziness. I would say Adventists are intellectually extremely lazy, especially when it comes to Bible study, because they've always had this crutch of Ellen White. Every discussion is ended by an Ellen White quote, and that's how you produce gross laziness. And so they have this legacy of laziness when it comes to true biblical study, and anyone who, transcends that pretty much leaves. Anyone who really studies the Bible for what it actually says is on their way out the door, or else they're trying to change the church from within, as I was trying to do for many years, even though I didn't believe much of what the church was teaching. But, I believe we're more accountable to God than we are to an employer. And even though Adventism was my employer, I had people say, hey, you shouldn't take a salary from these people unless you're parroting the party line. And I said, I'm ordained by the bloody palms, like Ford said. I'm ordained by the bloody palms. My ordination is from Christ himself. I'm accountable to God, not the general conference, not my conference president. If they don't like what I'm saying, they can fire me, which they eventually did. But I'm going to speak the truth. And ministers who don't do that aren't worth their salt. And there's a lot of them in Adventism who aren't speaking the truth to keep their jobs. I detest that, and I find it disgusting. But I never did that. I always preached what I believe. I took hell for it. I got a lot of opposition for it. But I always preached what I believe and wrote what I believed. And, I knew eventually I would be gone because of that, and I was. But I was really surprised that it lasted 35 years. I thought I would be gone long before that. But I think God just kind of protected me in the subculture to try to do as much good as I could in there.
So a snake happened to show up on the screen. And my question is this, because believe it or not, with me leaving, I've actually been called a snake. I've been called like being, I've the father of lies is who I follow. I've had people tell me some crazy stuff. My question is this though: do you think Ellen White is possibly the snake in Adventism?
Well, she's certainly the founding snake, and I think everything in Adventism can be traced directly back to Ellen White. I've said many times before, every single doctrine in Adventism can be traced to a vision from Ellen White. Adventists love to say, oh no, we all independently found our doctrines, and then Ellen White confirmed them. That's a total lie. Every single doctrine that Adventists accepted was accepted because of a vision from Ellen White. And I can prove that historically. There's no exception to that. It was always because of a vision from Ellen White that was ultimately accepted. And if there was no vision, then there was no acceptance. And, basically, Ellen's deceptions and dishonesty just speak for themselves. It's just her whole lifetime pattern is continual deception and dishonesty. And that's what the snake represents. He's a liar from the beginning. And Ellen White was the same thing. She was a deceiver from the beginning, and she never stopped being a deceiver her entire lifetime. And neither has the Adventist leadership that followed her. They did make that brief attempt at the 1919 conference, but they got undermined and betrayed by Washburn and others. And then you went into the dark ages of Adventism from 1919 to 1949. That was the most ridiculous, apologetic, perfectionistic, legalistic. That Adventism was the most disgusting ever. But they did try to
Well,
make some changes in the 50s, but that
and
got
we seem
quickly
to be
undermined.
having a resurgence of some of that in many areas that uh, people really, again, this call back to the pioneers that
Right,
taught
right.
perfectionism and all this, last generation theology. People speak out. People hate that nowadays, but it's like that's more closer to the original Adventism than
Absolutely.
whatever this
Seeking what
today
they
thing
sought.
is.
I get a kick out of that website, seeking what they sought.
Yeah,
Do you really want to seek what these cultic crazies sought? I mean, come on, these people were absolute extreme cultists to the max. You want to seek what
yeah,
they sought? But
yep,
it's really amazing to see what Adventism is today, and how there's really nothing there. I mean, it's just all over the place.
yeah,
And, it's in free fall. In chapter
yeah,
17 of the book I'm writing right now, I show how their actual membership or actual people who are involved with Adventism is more like 3 million than the 24 million that they're claiming. And
mm,
that's documented very carefully. They're in free fall. They know they're in free fall. And they're especially angry that a whole younger generation like you and Miles and Thunder, are all coming up that are basically going to make it very difficult for them to
yeah,
continue their lives. Day now has joined you, Ryan Day. Um, they're in bad shape because the younger generation now is making sure that they're not going to be able to perpetuate their deceptions the way they have for
yeah,
175 years.
yeah. So as we get close to, we're not going to make this a 4-hour session. I hope that we'll be honored and blessed to have you back again in the near future. I know that you're busy. You mentioned that you're working on another book. I'd love to just chat briefly. You don't have to tell us any details, but
Well, it's on my thread every day. Every day I post a segment of it and I get feedback on it. So it's just called Leaving Adventism, Why I Left, Why So Many Have Left, and Why So Many More Are Leaving. And
yeah,
I go into a lot of Adventist stuff that I didn't unpack in my other two books. And I have another one planned after this. It's called Harnessing God. So I'm always writing a book, and I enjoy getting feedback on whatever book I'm writing from my thread every day. So it's kind of a fun process.
when do you think that book will be completed? Do you have any idea?
I'm in chapter 19 right now of 20 chapters on the Leaving Adventism book. So we're
Okay.
getting close. I don't know how long it will take, to get it published. That can be a 6-month process sometimes, but
Yeah.
I'm hoping maybe by the end of 25 to have that one published and then start in on the Harnessing God as soon as I finish with this one. But
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I greatly appreciate the work that you put into that, and excited to see that come out. As we kind of close this down, we'll try to keep it to about a 2-hour segment. How would you? We're going to move off of kind of specifically Ellen White per se.
mhm.
How would you suggest those watching? How do you reach a normal Seventh-day Adventist and avoid getting caught up in the ultra like invested apologists that we see? Those tend to be non-productive conversations.
Yeah.
How do you reach people that are really looking for help?
Yeah, it's a good question because Adventists are so saturated in their insular subculture that, obviously someone like me, I have a brand label on me that I'm a can write type person. So stay away from that guy at all costs. You know, Adventism does not want to talk to me. They won't even acknowledge this, wide estate fraud book. They won't even talk about it. They won't even mention it in Spectrum. They won't mention it in AT because they know they have no answer for it. The wide estate at least tried to respond to my psychobiography but they haven't even tried to respond to the white estate fraud because it has them dead to rights. It's just absolutely documents that Arthur White was an extreme fraud, a liar, a thief. He colluded with Gary Johnson to produce a book of absolute lies about Can Wright. I mean, the stuff that is documented in that book, Adventism has absolutely no answer for. So their goal is to hope it goes away. Let's just try to ignore it. Let's just hope people don't find out about it. But, sooner or later, people are going to hear the truth one way or the other. And a book like The White Estate Fraud, annihilates Arthur White. And yet he's their great historian of Ellen White. He's their great white estate champion for all those years when he was committing the most atrocious kinds of dishonesty. And, he's the one that wouldn't allow the 1919 Bible Conference material to come to light. Once it was found in 1974, he kept it under wraps until he left the White Estate in 1978, and then Spectre managed to get some. But back in the day, Spectrum and AT were pretty respectable. Not so much anymore, but it's really tragic that Adventism has circled the wagons, even with AT and Spectrum, because they know they're in big trouble. They know they're in free fall, and they all have to kind of protect their jobs and their pensions and all this kind of stuff. But
it's disappointing. I can't imagine being the author of the book and having it not be engaged pretty much at all. It's disappointing. It reminds me, a scholar that I have a lot of respect and I learned a lot from. He's deceased now. Was Dr. Michael Heiser, and he always kind of had this funny way of, when something gets weird, move along, peon, nothing to see here, move along, don't, nothing here, and I feel like that's a lot of what happens inside of, when they get caught with their pants down. It's like, oh, the best thing to do is not engage, let's just not give it credit.
Don't pay attention to that man behind the curtain.
Yeah, it's so funny. Oh man,
really pitiful.
It is. It's really unfortunate. So as we exit out here, what has been your greatest satisfaction after leaving Adventism and helping people leave? Like, what has been some of your biggest positive moments?
Well, the little church I pastor is just completely gratifying. We've had 15 years of wonderful fellowship and community, and no big brother beating me over the head after every sermon, and I can preach the truth without having to put up with all the weirdos in Adventism. And that's just been a joy. I mean, it's just been, I wasn't really planning to keep pastoring in my 70s, but I enjoy it so much now that I have no desire to retire. Really, I'm very fulfilled in the stuff I'm doing, and the books I'm writing, and our congregation's just a wonderful spiritual family that gets along super well, and we just don't have the church politics and crap and all the stuff that I knew for 35 years in Adventism. There was always garbage going on in Adventism, always.
You mean outside of the Adventist church, you experienced unity? I thought everyone outside the church was dysfunctional.
That's the Adventist mantra, but it's the exact opposite. The pathology oozes in Adventism. And I'm not saying there isn't pathology in other churches, but I've never seen, I've been associated with a lot of other churches. I've been interdenominational and leading interdenominational groups, even for years and years and years while I was in Adventism. And I can honestly say the pathology in Adventism is right up there at the top because it is a secretive, dishonest, deceptive, cover up. You ask the question, what would happen if they really became honest all of a sudden?
Yeah.
It's the Church of God. I don't know if you're aware of what they did, but the Church of God did that very thing. And they, lost most of their right wingers. They lost most of their givers. They had to sell all their property to the Rock Church in Pasadena. And I mean, they took a devastating hit. But what remained was a group of evangelical Christians who loved the Lord and were a much more healthy community than the cult
Yeah.
that they discarded.
Yeah.
And, I don't know what would happen in Adventism compared to that, because it's a much larger group and it's much more hierarchical, and there are much more complicating factors as far as property. My belief is that anyone who tries to reform Adventism will have their butt kicked out of the church real quick. It doesn't really matter. When you start talking about money and the corruption, you're gone. And
Yeah.
that's why I expected to be gone after writing Adventism for a New Generation, because I really focused on the hierarchy, corruption, money, misuse of funds, um, disempowerment of the laity, all these kinds of things. But I was protected again by the subculture I was in, university subculture. But
Mm.
normally speaking, if you speak up against money or corruption or any of these kinds of things, they take no prisoners, because they're all about money. The Adventists really worship money. And that's something you just can't be speaking out against. And that's why our church got dissolved, Celebration Center, that I was the senior pastor of when I left Adventism, was because that was reaching out to former SDAs, and we had an arrangement with the conference that we didn't have to return the same amount of tithe to the conference that other churches did. And as other churches found out about this, Loma Linda University, 7,000 plus members, millions and millions of dollars, they started threatening the conference. Hey, if you're going to let Celebration do it, we're going to do it. And it wasn't long for Celebration to live about that time, because the conference realized, hey, follow the money here. We need to get rid of this church. And that's what they
Yeah.
did, basically.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, man, there's so many more topics I would love to spend an hour just talking to you about some of the money stuff and some of, tithing. I know I even messaged you. I was trying to find a quote. You helped me kind of pinpoint where that was at, specifically to the way tithing actually originated in the Adventist church. There's
Yeah.
just so many things. I know you've talked about a couple of other books that are coming down the pipeline. If someone was to pick up, and I want to encourage all of those that are watching now and later, if you haven't read Dr. Daly's books, whether or not, specifically the ones on Ellen White, I want to focus on whether or not you end up agreeing with everything he says or not. This is my question, Dr. Daly. How would you tell someone if they were picking your books up? How would you tell them to read your book? What would be the process? How would you tell them to like process through the information?
Yeah, I mean, everything depends on where a person's coming from. I have relatives that are hardcore right wing Adventists, and others that are academic Adventists. And, I have Adventists in high places that are my relatives and have secretly come to me and say, we agree with everything in the Psychobiography, but obviously we can't say it or be quoted, and all that kind of stuff. There's so much of that in Adventism that you really have to kind of know where a person's coming from to know what you would want to say or answer that question with. But, I think honest at heart is the critical thing. If a person's really honest at heart, I've had a lot of even right-wing Adventists say, wow, we just don't know what to do with this documentation. We've checked it out. It's accurate. It's in the wide estate. It's indisputable evidence and documentation, but we don't know what to do with it. We're just so devastated by this stuff that, I think there's a real tendency in Adventism today to try to minimize Ellen White, because they realize, hey, she's not going to stand up to scrutiny. Anybody who's aware of the research that's out there is going to understand she will not stand up to scrutiny. Therefore, we need to try to minimize her and act like she's not all really that important. And we really don't pay much attention to her anymore anyway. And the next step from there is, well, Adventism stands on its own apart from Ellen White. That's what a lot of people want to try to argue, which is a real problem because everything is traced to Ellen White. Everything comes out of Ellen White. Everything comes out of the bad tree, and the bad tree produces bad fruit. Not that God can't do good things in that context, which he has, and I got a lot of good things out of Adventism. But the bottom line is Ellen was a bad tree, and she produced a bad fruit in Adventism. And there's just more and more people understanding that and trying to help people get out from under that bondage, because it really is a bondage. Yeah. And even if you throw Ellen White out of the picture, it's still a controlling bondage. The way the church operates is under a spirit of control, spirit of dishonesty. It's a money-loving, money-serving community that tries to pretend to be spiritual, that makes all these ridiculous, ambitious spiritual claims for itself that are completely ridiculous. The GC is the voice of God. They got the GC coming up again. It's the voice of God on earth. We are the remnant. We have the true prophet. All these kinds of things are just so ridiculously, laughable to any reasonable person out there that they're becoming increasingly embarrassed, as more and more people understand what the subculture really involves.
Maybe it's a religious multi-level marketing scheme.
It really is.
As long as you buy her books, you're good, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why she could die in such debt, really the equivalent of about $3 million in debt in our money today. But she blackmailed the church basically and said, hey, you're going to get the income from my books all these years to come, so that can pay off the debts. So she just flagrantly spends herself into debt to the extreme, and then she still betrayed him because she did the exact opposite in her will that she told Adventists to do in their wills, and still tried to give as much money as she could to her family and withhold it from the church. But she did have that trump card that you're going to be able to get money from my books, even though it will come through the White estate and stuff, for years and years and years to come, because she knew good and well the Lord wasn't coming back soon, even though she lied about it her whole life.
Yeah, I have found a significant motif in Ellen White's history. This spirit of hypocrisy that just plagued all of her life. I mean, from her teachings to her writings to her, the way she treated other people, to her diet, her addiction to vinegar alcohol, to, like all these issues that were a part of that she constantly fought. Even money. I mean, like you were saying with money, it's like this constant, I feel bad saying motif because usually we use that in like academic terms with regards to the scripture, but but that was a theme that really rattled me, because all my life I knew of this woman as this godly woman that could do no wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I was being hit as I studied with all this, like, this information that, wait a second, this woman is deceptive. This woman is a hypocrite. This woman there's no way that she could be this infallible, like everything she wrote was from God and had no influence from, humans, and all these things that, Adventist apologists try to like negate nowadays.
Yeah. And she herself said, that's what's so amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, listen, so I have to set the record straight, because the actual title today was Ellen G. White, Prophetess or Pretender. And so, Dr. Daly, based on your professional opinion and research as a psychologist and a historian and a prolific author yourself that did not plagiarize all of your books, what what's the outcome? Is she a prophetess or is she a pretender?
100% pretender, and her legacy is 100% bad fruit. Whatever good came out of it, it's God gets the credit and the glory. None to Ellen White, because she's about as bad a tree as you're going to find when you look at the blasphemy, just the most terrible attributions to God, the lying, deceiving. When you just ask the spirits, it's a spirit of hypocrisy, spirit of deception, spirit of control, spirit of grasping money. Spirit of exploitation. She exploits her own flock. That you can't get much worse than exploiting your own followers and ripping them off. And she did that her whole life. So it's pretty sickening.
Well, that's what a lot of cult leaders do. So I know that I was very hesitant to use that term because of the stigma that comes with it, but it seems to fit to me.
Yeah, she was a lot more clever than David Koresh, but the same basic. He was a follower of hers, and he's just another fruit out of the bad tree that normally comes with the kind of stuff that her negative spirits produce.
Yeah. Well, man, listen, Dr. Daly, it has been so much fun. I have enjoyed the time. I hope that you have as well.
Great.
How do people connect with you if they want to engage in your content, and like how can people reach out and connect?
I've got authorstevedaly.com, my website, but I'm on the thread every day. I have a lot of people that read my thread every day, respond to it every day. I always say if a person wants to get a hold of me on Messenger, for example, go on the thread and say, hey, I have a message for you on Messenger, because I get way more messages on Messenger than I ever keep up with. So if you say on the thread, hey, I have a message for you on Messenger, then I'll go and look it up. And I respond to my texts pretty well. I don't just give out my cell phone to everybody, but text and the thread are the two easiest ways to get a hold of me. And the thread is the easiest because it's open to anyone. I've got my limit on friends, which is 5,000, but there's many more that come on to the thread than those that are actually responding to the thread. And you have to be one of the 5,000 to actually respond and get your comments on there. But there's a lot of people who follow it who aren't commenting on it. And if you want to become a friend, I have a waiting list, and I just anytime anyone drops off, I immediately replace them with someone from the waiting list. So you can become a friend and make comments and stuff, and then it's easy to contact me. Just say, if you have my number, I left you a text, which I see those anyway. But mainly it's Messenger, because I get a ton of stuff on Messenger and I don't come close to keeping up with it. So it's just important to say, hey, I left you a message on Messenger. Then I'll make sure I go and see what you left.
Awesome. Dr. Daly, thank you so much for your time. It was an honor. I hope that you will grace us with your presence again, digging into some other topics in the near future.
There's a ton of stuff I had written down here that we never got to. So hopefully we can do that next time around.
Let's do it. I love it.
Appreciate what you're doing. I'm so thrilled that people like you and Miles and Thunder and Day are all out there putting a whole new generation straight and where the deceptions of Adventism are concerned.
Well, we're trying. I'll tell you that we're trying. I don't know that we'll get it all done, but you've set up a great opportunity for us to follow in the giants that went before us. So we appreciate that. And that I do want to mention this, just since you have, don't forget, this will be coming up this Thursday with
Amen.
Ryan Day on his channel. So Rethinking Adventism. But until then, I truly do hope that you guys will stay in the Word of God, study hard, ask the Spirit to bask over you, heal from what it is that you might have been spiritually damaged from. Let the Lord do the work. Believe in the truth, and that is Jesus Christ and Him only crucified. Amen. Be blessed, and we will see you next time, okay? God bless, friends.
Thank you so much, Mike. God bless.
Thank you. God bless.